Adrian Cole was a man whose very name commanded respect in the corporate world. A man who had clawed his way to the top with ruthless determination, whose empire sprawled across industries, and who was celebrated as one of the youngest and most successful CEOs in the city. And yet beneath the shimmering surface of power and glory was a heart hardened by pride and an obsession with appearances. For to Adrian, everything was about image, about how people looked at him, about being admired and envied, and unfortunately that obsession made him blind to the quiet devotion of his wife Elena, a woman who once stood by him when he had nothing, who loved him for his laughter before it was replaced with arrogance, who believed in him when the world doubted him. But now that success had turned him into a star in society's eyes, he saw her not as his partner, but as a blemish on his perfect picture. For Elena was simple, her beauty not loud or sparkling like the glamorous women who followed him at events. She wore plain dresses, and her hair was often tied back in simple braids. Her skin bare of makeup, her smile soft and shy, and though countless people would have seen the warmth and kindness in her eyes as a rare and precious beauty, Adrian saw only flaws, only imperfections, only a woman who did not fit the image of the glittering social circles he now moved in. And so on the night of the annual Cole Enterprises Charity Gala, the most prestigious event of the season where politicians, celebrities, business tycoons, and the media would all gather under the glow of chandeliers, Elena timidly stepped into his study, holding in her hands a light blue gown she had saved for months to buy, a dress that wasn't extravagant but carried the delicate charm of her soul, a gown with soft embroidery at the hem that reminded her of spring mornings and quiet skies. Her eyes hopeful as she stood before her husband, and for once she believed. He would smile, that he would nod and say she looked lovely, that he would finally take her by his side and show her off as the woman who had loved him through everything. But Adrian looked up from his phone, his sharp eyes scanning her nervously, clasped hands clutching the gown, and instead of warmth, there was a smirk of disdain curling his lips. "You can't wear that," he said coldly, his voice dripping with judgment. "Do you even realize how ridiculous you'd look standing next to me in front of everyone? Elena, this isn't a village fair. This is the gathering of the most powerful and beautiful people in the city. This is about elegance, about image, and I can't let people whisper behind my back because of you." His words came like daggers, stabbing at her fragile heart, and Elena's lips trembled as she whispered, "Adrian, I only wanted to stand by your side, to be proud of you, to support you." But he waved his hand dismissively, his reflection in the mirror, more important to him than the tears glistening in her eyes. "Support me by staying here," he snapped, while adjusting his cufflinks. "The last thing I need is to be embarrassed by you." And without another word, he grabbed his tailored suit jacket and stormed out of the room. The echo of the door slamming behind him, crashing into Elena's chest like a verdict she could no longer deny. She sank onto the edge of the bed still, holding the gown in her arms, her tears finally breaking free. And as the sound of his departing footsteps faded down the hall, she clutched the fabric against her heart as though it could protect her from the storm inside. But nothing could. Nothing except the memories that came flooding back uninvited. Memories of the girl she once was, of the boy he once was. Back in the days when they had little more than dreams to hold on to. When she had believed in him so fiercely that she worked 2 jobs to help him pay for his first office space. When she had stitched his torn shirts with tired fingers while whispering encouragements into his ears. When his smile had been her reward and his embrace her sanctuary. How different that boy was from the man who now looked at her as though she were shame itself. And she asked herself how love could sour into this. How the boy who once kissed her hand with reverence could now mock her as unworthy. Her chest burned with humiliation, but beneath it all there was something stirring, something she had not felt in years. a spark of anger, of dignity, of self-respect, a whisper in her heart that told her she was not worthless, that she had given too much of herself to be treated like a shadow. And though she wasn't ready to act on it, though she still loved him despite everything, that whisper planted a seed in her soul, a seed that would one day bloom into defiance. Across the city, Adrian arrived at the gala in his limousine, the cameras flashing as he stepped out in his tailored suit, the media shouting his name, and he felt invincible, convinced that by leaving Elena behind, he looked stronger, sharper, more untouchable. But as he walked through the grand entrance beneath glittering chandeliers and into the sea of shimmering gowns and black tuxedos, he couldn't quite escape the curious stares. People noticed her absence. Whispers floated around like smoke. Where is his wife? Didn't she always stand quietly behind him? Is something wrong? And though he pretended not to hear, pouring himself into shallow conversations with women who laughed too loudly, their jewels sparkling under, the light deep down, a faint unease began to gnaw at him, but he silenced it with champagne. While back at the penthouse, Elena sat in the dim room staring at her reflection in the mirror. The blue gown spread across her lap like a broken dream, her eyes red from crying yet glimmering with something new, something dangerous. The faint light of awakening, she whispered into the silence. Never again. And though the words were soft, they carried the weight of a vow that one day she would no longer be invisible, that one day she would stand tall not to please him, not to prove anything to those who mocked her, but to reclaim the dignity she had allowed to be trampled. And as the city lights flickered against the window, her heart throbbed with both sorrow and resolve, unaware that this very night, this cruel rejection, would become the fire that would forge her transformation. And though Adrian smiled for the cameras, believing he had triumphed by leaving her behind, the truth was that the woman he had dismissed as nothing was beginning a journey that would shatter his pride. For destiny had a way of punishing arrogance and rewarding resilience, and Elena was about to discover that the tears she shed tonight would one day turn into the strength that made the world bow in awe. The days that followed the gala were heavy with silence in the cold penthouse, a silence that was not born from peace, but from wounds too deep to heal. Elena moved about the rooms like a ghost, performing the routines she always had. Preparing Adrian's meals, keeping the house in order, answering polite greetings with soft nods. But inside her, something had shifted forever. She was no longer the timid woman who cried herself to sleep and believed that love meant enduring humiliation. Her whispered vow of never again echoed in her heart every morning as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. And with each passing day, the pain began to turn into strength, a strength she herself had not expected to find. She began to read again, books on self-worth, on style, on confidence, on the stories of women who had reinvented themselves after heartbreak, and slowly she began to imagine a version of herself that was not chained to Adrian's approval. She joined a small wellness studio downtown under the pretext of volunteering, but secretly began training. Yoga in the mornings, cardio at night, not to lose weight for anyone else, but to feel her body come alive again. She learned how to care for her skin, how to use makeup not as a mask, but as an art of self-expression. She began experimenting with hairstyles, with fabrics, with colors, learning that beauty was not about fitting into anyone's box, but about embracing her own essence. And most importantly, she began to speak, to interact with people outside Adrian's circle, women who saw her not as a shadow, but as someone with warmth and intelligence, and with every compliment, every smile exchanged, her confidence slowly stitched itself back together. Meanwhile, Adrian noticed changes, but dismissed them as trivial. Too wrapped in his own world of deals and media appearances, he returned home late from endless parties, often smelling of perfume that wasn't Elena's. And though she felt the sting, she no longer confronted him. She simply observed, calm and detached, as though watching the slow unraveling of a man who thought he could control everything. Adrian's arrogance only grew as whispers in society began to question his marriage. Reporters asking why Elena no longer appeared by his side, but Adrian brushed it off, claiming she was unwell or uninterested, boasting that he was better received without her. Yet deep down, an unease was beginning to take root. For the women, he paraded himself with never stayed long. They came for his money, his fame, his name, but none looked at him the way Elena once did. None offered the silent loyalty she had given him, and though he would never admit it, he began to feel something missing, something hollow. Still, he pushed it away, believing he was untouchable, that Elena would always remain in the background waiting for him to decide her worth. But life has a way of punishing arrogance, and the first strike came unexpectedly, when one evening, Elena received an invitation of her own, a private message from a renowned fashion house who had seen her at the wellness studio through a mutual friend. Intrigued by her quiet grace and natural aura, they invited her to a small event, nothing like the grand galas Adrian attended, but an intimate gathering celebrating authenticity and personal journeys. At first, Elena wanted to decline, fear gripping her heart, but then she remembered her vow, and something inside urged her to accept. She spent days preparing, not to impress anyone but to honor herself. She chose a gown unlike any she had worn before, elegant yet simple, with flowing lines that complemented her figure. She let her hair cascade down her shoulders in soft waves, applied a touch of makeup that highlighted the sparkle in her eyes, and when she finally looked into the mirror, she gasped, not because she had become someone else, but because for the first time she saw the beauty that had always been there, hidden beneath years of self-doubt and Adrian's cruelty. That night, as she walked into the event hall, heads turned, conversations paused, and people whispered not in mockery but in admiration. She was radiant, glowing with the kind of beauty that came from within. And for the first time in years, Elena felt alive. She laughed, she conversed, she shared her thoughts, and people listened, truly listened, for she carried herself with a grace that no amount of wealth could buy. And it was at this very event that fate began weaving its threads. For among the attendees were several influential figures, editors, designers, philanthropists, who were captivated not by a glamorous facade, but by the authenticity Elena exuded. One of them, a woman named Celeste, a former model turned mentor. For young women approached her with a smile and said, "You have something rare, Elena, something the world needs to see. Would you allow me to help you find it?" And though Elena hesitated, she agreed, thus beginning a new chapter in her life, with Celeste guiding her through the world of self-expression and public presence, not to mold her into someone else, but to help her embrace who she truly was. In the weeks that followed, Elena bloomed like a flower, long denied sunlight. She attended workshops, learned about fashion, about posture, about using her voice. She began to carry herself differently, no longer apologizing for her existence, and soon whispers about her transformation began to spread quietly. Whispers that eventually reached the ears of Adrian. At first he laughed, dismissing it as nonsense, convinced no one could possibly be impressed by the woman he had so easily dismissed. But that confidence began to crack the evening he attended a high-profile art exhibition hosted by one of his closest associates. For as he strutted through the crowd, basking in attention, the room suddenly fell into a hush. Heads turned toward the entrance, cameras flashing, and when Adrian followed their gaze, his breath caught in his throat. For there stood Elena, not the timid, plain wife he had left behind, but a vision of poise and elegance, her gown shimmering under the lights, her posture regal, her smile soft yet confident, and her eyes, those eyes he once ignored, now burned with a strength that made his chest tighten. She walked through the crowd gracefully, people parting for her, admirers greeting her with warmth, and Adrian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Fear that he had underestimated her. Fear that the woman he had mocked was now becoming someone untouchable. He tried to compose himself, tried to pretend he was unaffected, but inside his pride was shaking. For the whispers around him were no longer about his success. They were about her, about Elena, the woman he thought he could hide, the woman who had just stolen the spotlight effortlessly. And as he watched, her laugh with dignitaries and artists, as he saw men and women alike drawn to her radiance, Adrian realized with a sickening twist that he had thrown away a diamond while chasing glitter. Yet it was too late, for Elena glanced at him only once, her gaze calm and steady, not filled with longing, but with a quiet detachment that told him she no longer needed his approval, that she was beyond his grasp, and that single look pierced his heart more deeply than any insult could. The exhibition ended with Elena being approached by a famous magazine editor who invited her to be featured in a special issue on women of resilience. And when she agreed, the crowd erupted in applause, leaving Adrian standing in the shadows of the very world he thought he ruled, humiliated not by her words but by her undeniable presence. And as the night drew to a close, Elena left the hall surrounded by admiration, her heart lighter than ever, for she knew she had finally broken free of the chains he had bound her with. And though she had not yet decided what future awaited her, one thing was certain. She would never again bow to his arrogance, and Adrian, for the first time in his life, felt the icy touch of regret, a regret that would only grow as her star continued to rise while his world began to crumble. The weeks after the art exhibition unfolded like a cruel mirror for Adrian. For everywhere he went, he found Elena's presence haunting him, not as the timid woman who once trailed behind him, but as the dazzling figure the world now seemed to celebrate. Her magazine cover graced billboards across the city. Her interviews filled with wisdom and humility went viral. Her presence was requested at charities, conferences, and social events. And the irony that the same people who once ignored her now hung onto her. Every word was not lost on Adrian. He seethed with a mixture of jealousy and shame, for he had been the one who dismissed her as unworthy, yet now she shone brighter than he ever could. He watched as high society embraced her, as businessmen sought her opinions, as women admired her courage, and as young girls called her an inspiration, while he, the man who once held all the power, found himself fading into the background, his arrogance cracking under the weight of whispers that now painted him not as a visionary, but as the fool who had failed to cherish his own wife. At first he tried to deny it, convincing himself it was a temporary fascination, that the world would eventually forget her and return its gaze to him. But as invitations continued to pour in for her, and not for him, as her face appeared on every platform, he realized with a sickening jolt that Elena was no longer his shadow. She was the light. Desperate to reclaim what he thought was his, Adrian began attempting to reach out to her, sending lavish bouquets to her apartment, calling her repeatedly, leaving messages dripping with false charm. "I miss you, Elena. Let's talk. You belong with me." But she never responded. She had moved out quietly after the exhibition, choosing a small but elegant apartment of her own. A place filled not with luxury, but with peace. A place where she could breathe without the weight of his scorn. And though at night she sometimes lay awake remembering the boy he once was, the boy who had once made her laugh under the rain and dream of forever, she never allowed nostalgia to chain her, for she knew the man Adrian had become was not the boy she loved. And her journey was now her own. Adrian's desperation only grew as the annual Winter Ball approached, the grandest event of the season where the city's elite gathered, the same kind of event where he once refused to take her. This time he was determined to make her appear with him, to show the world that she was still tied to his name. So he arrived at her apartment unannounced, waiting at her door with a look of forced humility when she opened the door, dressed simply, in a cream blouse and skirt, her hair tied elegantly. He felt for a moment the urge to fall to his knees. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "I was wrong. I was blind. I should have cherished you. But now I see it. I see you. Please come with me to the winter ball. Stand by my side like you once did. We can be stronger together." His eyes glistened with something close to sincerity, but Elena's gaze was steady, calm, and though a storm of emotions twisted inside her, she answered with a strength that surprised even herself. "Adrian, you don't see me, not truly. You only see what you've lost, not what I've become. I begged for years for your respect and your love, and you crushed me every time. Now you regret it because the world sees me, not because your heart does. And I will not go back to being invisible, not for you, not for anyone." Her words hit him harder than any blow, and he staggered back, his pride wounded, but his obsession only deepened. The night of the winter ball arrived, and Adrian stood in the grand hall alone, dressed in his finest suit, forcing a smile for cameras that no longer lingered on him. But the moment Elena entered, the room seemed to tilt. She wore a gown of deep emerald that shimmered like starlight, her hair cascading in soft waves, her presence commanding without effort, and the crowd erupted in admiration. She was no longer just a woman transformed. She was a force, walking with a quiet confidence that made others part before her as if she were royalty. Adrian's chest tightened painfully as he watched dignitaries, entrepreneurs, and artists rush to greet her, as laughter and warmth surrounded her like a shield. And for the first time in his life, he felt small, invisible, irrelevant. He tried to approach her, pushing through the crowd with a trembling smile, calling her name softly. "Elena." But when her eyes met his, they no longer held love or pain. Only a calm distance. She inclined her head politely as one might to a stranger, and turned away, resuming her conversation with a senator's wife, leaving him frozen in the middle of the glittering hall, the whispers around him cruel. Is that the husband who left her behind? How blind could he have been? She's better off without him. Each word cutting into his pride until he felt naked before them. He left the ball early, retreating into the darkness of his limousine, staring out the window as regret gnawed at him like a relentless beast. For the empire he built, the power he wielded, the money he hoarded, none of it mattered now, because he had lost the one person who had truly loved him, the woman who had once stitched his dreams together with her own hands, the woman who had bloomed into greatness without him, and as the car carried him through the city lights, he whispered into the emptiness, "I had everything, and I destroyed it." His reflection in the glass, a stranger, hollow and broken. While across the city, Elena returned to her apartment with a heart free of chains, standing before her mirror not to check if she was enough, but to smile at the woman she had become, strong, radiant, whole. She touched the emerald gown gently and whispered, "Never again will I let someone decide my worth." Her voice steady, her eyes shining with tears, not of sorrow but of triumph, for she knew she had closed the chapter of a loveless marriage and stepped into a future she would write on her own terms. And while Adrian drowned in the bitter ocean of his regret, Elena walked forward into a horizon of endless possibility, her story no longer tied to his arrogance but to her own unshakable strength, a story that would inspire countless others, proving that sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger or vengeance, but rising so high that the one who once crushed you is forced to watch, powerless as you shine,